Thank you all for attending this WEI webinar with Infoblox. I'm Shawn Murphy. I'm a cybersecurity solutions architect here at WEI. And very high level, just to kind of give you a sketch of what we focus on the cybersecurity practice, I think of it as aligned with the NIST cybersecurity framework. So that's the circle in the middle. All things in NIST begin with identifying your assets and your risks associated with those assets. So I put together a little sort of mission statement for this area of the cybersecurity practice. We want to provide a source of truth for all enterprise assets. That's devices, users, data. We might touch on IPAM today, so your IP and the devices that are leasing those IP addresses. And this is super important, having a complete picture of your estate and what you're trying to protect and the vulnerabilities on that infrastructure, because you can't protect what you don't know about. And that leads into the second area of focus here at WEI, which is the zero trust and network security practice. This is probably the largest area of focus at WEI because of our strong networking heritage. But zero trust, in my mind, provides proactive protection against threats, and it limits blast radius. And it does this by eliminating implicit trust decisions across all of your infrastructure. And again, this is very relevant, and I think we're going to touch on zero trust as we go through the conversation today, because DNS is a central piece of infrastructure and helps prevent threats in the first place and helps limit impact of new and emerging threats as they come out. Inevitably, no matter how well you do securing your infrastructure, there's a possibility that threats get past. So organizations must have security operations, and this could be a physical security operations center, or it could be a virtual and distributed security operations team. It could be in-house, or it could be outsourced to third parties. But in all cases, the goal is pretty simple. It's to protect, detect, and rapidly respond to new and emerging threats. And we do that by collecting good data, performing analytics on that data to find that needle in a haystack, to find that threat that's on the network, and then scaling our ability to respond with automation tools. And then the last area, as I mentioned, we've helped customers build their infrastructure over time, and a lot of them are going through a cloud transformation journey. And as part of that, we can help customers architect their cloud properties to be in accordance with best practices, make sure that everything is configured properly to achieve their outcomes while not introducing additional risk. And when I think of cloud from a cybersecurity point of view, I think of runtime protection, so our actual workloads and defending those from exploit attempts by threat actors, while on the other hand, also not introducing new vulnerabilities by protecting our CI/CD pipelines and make sure our code isn't introducing additional threats or additional vulnerabilities that threats could take advantage of. So in all of these areas, WEI has engineers, various products, various services we can offer. I was planning on leaving this for the end when we wrap up as a call to action, but I wanted to plug, because it's relevant for our conversation today about DNS, that WEI offers what we call a 5-minute DNS security assessment. So it's, as the name suggests, a very light lift. We install a script in your environment, and it will test your existing security stack for a variety of different DNS-based threats. There's a list there of common TTPs that threat actors use, and a lot of these are bringing back memories of my first role in incident response, where it was my job to look through massive PCAP files to find things like DNS tunneling or command and control or DGAs. And back in the day, we had to do this by hand, effectively, scrolling through and searching for things that looked suspicious. The beauty of Infoblox and their investment in threat intelligence and protective DNS means that you can block a lot of these threats before they even get on the network. So in my incident response days, we were always responding to a threat and trying to rewind the tape and figure out how they got in and what they took. It makes a lot of sense to block them at the front door. The output that you can expect from this quick 5-minute assessment is effectively a table showing how your DNS infrastructure does at protecting the organization against many of these TTPs. So on the far right column here, you can see these are the percentages that were blocked by the existing infrastructure in an environment that we ran this in. And the inverse of this is how many are allowed. And some of those numbers are kind of shocking. I will say that this doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get owned. It just means that other tools are probably doing a lot of the heavy lifting in protecting against threats. So a simple example would be malicious domains. It looks like 88% of those malicious domains are resolved in this environment. Maybe my machine can communicate with a malicious domain and download some malware, but when I try and execute it, my EDR agent prevents it from executing. So a big part of DNS security is defense in depth, and if you can protect these from these threats up front, then you're removing a lot of the heavy lifting from the rest of your infrastructure. And we can kind of talk through how that would work in your environment and what next steps could be to improve your ability to block some of these threats. So with that, I'll move into the topic of the webinar today, which is understanding the impact of DNS on cyber resilience, defense in depth, which I just talked a little bit about, and zero trust, which is a big focus area here at WEI as well. So I'm super excited to welcome two esteemed guests from Infoblox, Cricket Lou, who I'm a big fan of. I'd like your signature at some point, Cricket, if we meet in person. He's the world's leading expert on DNS. I have one of your editions of DNS in Bind, the classic book that everyone must have. Cricket's a prolific speaker and author, and he's effectively the liaison between Infoblox and the broader DNS community. And he's joined by his colleague, Jim Mosley from the UK, which you will quickly pick up on as he has the accent. And he's responsible for managing the top level domain DNS services for some critical infrastructure in the UK and major global tech companies as well. He has a long history with DNS, lots of experience with implementations and migrations and custom integrations, and near and dear to my heart, DNS related threat intelligence, which I think is an important area of research. So the format for today is Cricket and Jim will have a conversation about these topics, and we encourage it to be interactive. So if you have questions, feel free to chime into chat, and we'll try and weave them in. Cricket and Jim are monitoring chat, and I might interject as well with some questions from chat. So with that, I'll hand the ball back to you, Cricket and Jim, to take it away. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much, Shawn, and thank you very much to WEI for having us today. So we're going to talk a little bit about DNS security, which is fortunate because it's one of the few topics that I know something about. But it's been kind of a big deal for us. We've had a number of major developments in the area of DNS security, and in particular, guidelines related to DNS security lately. Jim was one of the authors of a set of recommendations, a set of best practices related to DNS security, which we're going to talk about. And also, we have a new document coming out that we'll refer to, which is called NIST Special Publication 800-81, R3 technically, which my colleague Ross Gibson and I contributed to, which is a set of NIST-sponsored best practices for DNS security. But maybe we can start with the best practices paper that you guys wrote, Jim. Why did you write it, and what needs were you trying to address?
Yeah, it's sort of a collaboration, I guess, of SMEs and Infoblox, and we're really seeing, I suppose, a growing need to lay out security best practices beyond what we traditionally think of in terms of DNS, which is getting an IP address when querying a domain name. I think for a lot of organizations, DNS or using DNS as security mechanism flies sort of under the radar, and we see a lot of it, a lot of exploitation around it, whether it's things like misconfigurations within people's DNS estate, or whether it's DNS used within infrastructure of malicious actors. It's used for C2 communication. It's used to exfiltrate data, etc. And that's something that historically has not been associated with DNS. What I've found and certainly seen within EMEA is customers asking about compliance standards such as NIST. You've mentioned that already, so Shawn, NIST 2 and DORA as well. And they're questions really that are driven by regulators who delegate, if you like, work with supervisory bodies. They in turn use compliance frameworks, such as threat-led penetration testing. And then their organizations have got to take all of these different compliance requirements and distill them into their own policy. So you've got people in end customer organizations in the areas of network security, compliance, audit teams, etc., really looking to us for guidance in creating their own policies as part of that overall sort of response to that. And as you said, one of the recent positives in all of this is the very recent addition of a new revision of NIST, I think revised since 2013. And so that's a good sort of neutral thing to look at, and look at some best practices there, what should be done to secure networks, etc.
Yeah, I should probably mention that first of all, the NIST document is freely available. I'll drop the link into the chat, and it's also in its comment period. So if you're a real DNS security enthusiast, you can pull down a copy of the document, read through it, and send in any comments that you have up until, I believe, May 26th. I think that's the end of the comment period. But even if you'd just like to download it, give it a read, you can see some of the new additions to the document. Now, Jim, one of the first things that your paper in particular mentions, and actually is also covered by the new version of 800-81, is encrypted DNS and ensuring that your DNS infrastructure has the capacity to handle it. So, for the folks on the call who may not be familiar with encrypted DNS, what is it?
Well, it's really an evolution of standards, if you like. It's sort of securing the last mile of DNS for privacy and security reasons. Traditionally, DNS has obviously been UDP traffic. We all know port 53. But that traffic can now be carried over transport like TLS, HTTPS, and now QUIC. And the protocols are really encrypting the traffic between the DNS client and the resolver, hence the last mile comment to prevent things like snooping. And there's a sort of increase in usage of that, really related to things like CISA, the US government organization, mandating that encrypted DNS should be used within federal networks. People may have seen it within browsers, for instance. There was a lot of talk around Firefox when they introduced that, for example, and it potentially being a conduit of uncontrolled, if you like, unmanaged DNS queries. So there's been talk of it being a two-edged sword, as it were, both for securing the protocol on the wire, if you like, but also potentially hiding things from enterprise security teams. So interesting topic.
Yeah, it definitely is that double-edged sword. So you have on the one hand important safeguards against snooping and also what am I thinking, spoofing, right? Because of course any transmission between a stub resolver and a recursive DNS server
Right.
could also be spoofed if it's entirely in the clear. So this is also a protection against that, which is really important. Some parts of the world that actually happens relatively routinely. So behind, for example, the Great Firewall of China, there's routine spoofing so that you can't get to Western social media sites, for example.
Yeah, and there's even been a case of, for instance, a root name server, let's say advertising its Anycast instance on the internet, and so responses are received from within China, and networks there have been passing back spoof responses, which is obviously possible without encrypted DNS and DNSSEC especially.
Yeah, yeah. Now, what about the effects that encrypted DNS has on DNS servers? Are there additional resource requirements that I need to be aware of? Are there support requirements, certain versions that I need to run?
Yeah, you need obviously servers to support those newer protocols, and definitely not all DNS servers are created equal. Microsoft have the DNS role, obviously, that can be put on domain controllers, but it doesn't support DOH, DOT as clients, for instance. It will enable it to be a client, but not to receive queries from it. And of course, you need increased resources to support the encryption that's taking place. Um, so there's going to be an overhead. It can be a bit of a swings and roundabouts things, because you might get a persistent connection through TCP as opposed to UDP, but just overall you're going to need more resources to do that, and you're clearly going to want you to instrument your DNS servers so that you can see the resource usage as you adopt the newer protocols. It's all really best done on dedicated DNS resolver infrastructure. That's certainly what I'm familiar with in terms of managing large scale governmental sort of infrastructure. Um,
Yeah.
and this new 881 draft mentions things like separation of duties. Something as critical as DNS to a network probably needs to be on its own infrastructure. It's certainly been a best practice for a long time to separate recursion, the DNS servers providing answers to the clients, from the name servers that actually give those answers out, the authoritative servers. It's a default for the way the whole internet works, and really should be applied within companies' networks. Um, an analogy really would be having security measures sort of split up between EDR, firewalls, proxies, etc. You wouldn't have all your eggs in one basket. So definitely have dedicated infrastructure. It also means from a network perspective that you can secure that infrastructure. Um, and it's just going to be behind its own rules. Zero trust has been mentioned. We should have infrastructure that's only receiving DNS queries and not multiple protocols on multiple ports. Um, if we think about it, if even if AD domain controllers did support DOH DOT, we'd be asking it to do all of the things that a domain controller does, plus name resolution, plus then encrypting that. So, yeah, deployment considerations is something to watch out for.
Yeah, and certainly one of the object lessons in not putting all of your eggs in one basket, not running, for example, on a domain controller or on Windows generally, is the huge CrowdStrike outage that occurred.
Oh.
So that took
Yeah,
out Windows platforms all over the place, including many, many, many of them that supported DNS servers.
yeah, and prior to that, the problems with the protocol that Samba's based on. So it's
Oh,
happened before, definitely. So yeah, you want resilient infrastructure that's not going to be taken down with anything else, essentially.
yeah, yeah. It might be worth pointing out. I know that you said that each one of the encrypted DNS protocols imposes a certain amount of overhead on the DNS
Mm,
that support it. It's kind of a hierarchy, isn't it? I mean, because there's DNS over HTTPS, which you might think of as the most taxing of them, because you're running HTTPS over TCP, actually HTTP over
over
TLS
TLS, over
over
TCP,
TCP.
yeah, yeah. It's also the most common one, DOH. It's also, I guess, arguably from a security standpoint, the most risky as well because it's hiding in plain sight within uh, within HTTPS traffic. So really, you want to kind of secure that because there's malware that uses DOH in its communication. You probably want to not allow that traffic to the well-known open resolvers like Google's open resolver because you just don't want anything communicating with that could be malware on your network.
Yeah, yeah. And we actually have a response policy zone feed, if I remember correctly, that you can plumb into your DNS infrastructure to prevent the resolution of the domain names that then point to those DNS over HTTPS endpoints. So that could be handy for
Yeah,
some.
yeah, I should remember that actually because I created it originally. So yeah. Yeah.
Right. No, you also mentioned something in your paper that is very near and dear to my heart, which is DNS as a foundational layer of a cybersecurity architecture. So let's talk a little bit about that. What role can DNS play in an organization's security architecture?
Yeah, this is a big new change really in the NIST 881. I mean, it's a point that I'll labor a lot probably, but DNS is all seeing, right? Applications, services, devices tend to all communicate by doing the first thing, a DNS lookup. Sounds basic and obvious, but it's ubiquitous. It's always been there. It's not the first sort of thing we think about. And because of its sort of unique place in the network, it's well suited to blocking malicious traffic at scale. It doesn't require any state to be kept, deep packet inspection, for instance, though those kind of things that are more of an intensive overhead. And in saying that, of course, you're not going to throw away your firewall or your EDR. This is about defense in depth. Um, but it can block malicious activity before a firewall or EDR needs to start dealing with it. That might save resources in those kind of systems. So I think, as Shawn mentioned in the introduction, it's about defense in depth there. So it's really a foundational part of the security infrastructure. And we typically term it protective DNS as an industry. Um, and that's referring to effectively inspecting DNS traffic for the names that it's being queried for or the IP addresses being returned and blocking based on that.
Yeah, yeah. Are there particular advantages to using DNS as a security tool?
Yeah, a good reference is what somebody said from NSA, which is about 92% of malware would be blocked, both from a sort of command and control perspective, and also the deployment of malware on a particular network. And really that's because when you're creating malware, what you don't want to do is put specific IPs in. They're going to be blocked. What you want to do is this evolving monster that is perhaps going to use something like a domain generation algorithm or whatever it does to go to its command and control environment. It's going to change where it downloads malware from, etc. But all of that can be blocked through threat intelligence focused on DNS and act as a mitigation for all of that. I mean, DNS scales as well. If we think that it's the largest distributed database on the internet, DNS can handle millions of domain names, so it can handle millions of indicators of compromise. You could even block whole level domains if you wanted to, if you felt that was suitable from a business perspective.
Yeah.
Um, so it not only is blocked in the devices we traditionally think of like laptops, but it will also block stuff that doesn't have any endpoint protection on it. So think of IoT and operational technology devices. They're not stuff that you can install any endpoint protection on, but you can sort of wrap them in protective DNS so that if they're querying malicious domains in some way, you can restrict that. And you can really provide the same sort of protection to different types of networks that your organization's got, whether it's cloud workloads, as well as a traditional infrastructure we think of, as well as somebody working from a coffee shop for a time. So it's that ubiquitous layer because of everything starting with a DNS query. Um, I'd say also it's invaluable in incident response. I mean, you can log the good queries or what you think is good now, as well as the stuff that you block. And that's really good from a sort of incident response forensics point of view. And people have used it within incident response to do things like disrupt any malware, obviously, that's there, but also prevent reinfection. If you get in an incident response company, you know what uh, malware you've got on your network. If you understand things like the C2 domains from that and whatever, you can block it. But it also gives you visibility of where it's still in your network and perhaps the scope of the infection. So very powerful again, because I labor the point that everything starts with a DNS query.
Yeah, yeah. And you talked about the scalability, the number of IOCs that DNS can accommodate. That's not
Mm.
academic. I mean, our threat feeds today include millions of IOCs. So you have to have a technology that can actually accommodate all of that and
Mm.
block the resolution of all of that. And in most cases, even the biggest firewalls would have a difficult time with that.
Yeah, you get a lot of bang for your buck, so to speak. Which of course we would say, but it's it's a demonstrable thing. Governments deploy it at scale for a reason. Um, so
Yeah. What you said about blocking entire top level domains, that is not purely academic. I mean, I know there are some, I think it's TK, isn't it, which is like Tokelau, and there were a few others that were still in use, like the Soviet Union's old SU and Yugoslavia's old YU. Those are just cesspools. There is really no good that comes out of domain names under those TLDs, and it's as they say, the work of a moment to block resolution of everything in,
uh,
SU, YU, TK,
yeah,
places.
yeah. If you're a business that for instance doesn't do any transaction with Russia, for instance, and you block RU, you can do that, but you might also use this kind of technique to let through certain exceptions for your users. So if they come to you and say, well, I really need to access this domain under .xyz, which seems to be a soup of malware, then you can say, okay, we'll let that one through.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. So is there more that you can do with DNS if you have both protective DNS and you have it integrated with other parts of your security infrastructure?
Yeah, again, because it is the first line of defense, if you like, or the first thing that happens in communication. It's kind of the, I suppose, canary in a coal mine in that it can trigger automation when perhaps assets try to reach out to something that's a malicious website or whatever. And you might have, I guess you call it passive integration in the sense that you might send alerting to a SIEM, but you might develop that towards automated vulnerability scanning or quarantine devices, for instance. Another great example might be just moving it into a more restrictive group from a firewall policy perspective. Um, I don't think there's much in the way of the security ecosystem that doesn't attempt to integrate with everything else or have integration points. So you can signal out to those other elements of software.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, we talked earlier about zero trust, or Shawn certainly talked about zero.
Mm.
Is there a part that protective DNS can play in a zero trust architecture?
Yeah, I mean, I'm no zero trust expert, but assuming
Nor am
that no element, node, or service is implicitly trusted on the network,
I. Yeah.
which is how I view it, then you'd want to avoid in a zero trust implementation. What you'd want to avoid is an unsecured protocol that's allowed to communicate to the internet. And if you're not securing DNS, that's effectively what you're doing. So you want to secure DNS as part of any DNS architecture. The protected DNS we've talked about is ideally suited to that, really. And again, coming back to those sort of IoT, OT type devices, if zero trust architecture is based on user authentication, those devices are not going to do that. But you could wrap them in DNS. I guess I picture zero trust as sort of a series of compartmentalized boxes from the different services and applications on the networks, with each box sort of having a bouncer on the door who's controlling who can come in and out. But if the bouncer doesn't look in the DNS bag, anything could be in there, whether it's data being exfiltrated, C2 communication, or whatever. So securing that's really critical in terms of zero trust.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know if you mentioned it, but Microsoft's zero trust approach actually involves protective DNS, doesn't it? And
Yeah,
encrypted DNS both. They're
both. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. They're Windows clients that are part of a zero trust ecosystem use encrypted DNS to talk to a trusted DNS server. So that encryption gives them the server authentication, proves that they are talking to the right server, and also makes sure that the integrity of the data that they exchange with that server is protected. And
Yeah.
then they've modified the networking stack so that Windows will not connect to any IP addresses that have not been resolved by that
Mm.
trusted server.
Yeah, I think of it like that's the firewall that you start up with denying in terms of rules, and then you allow things through. For a lot of organizations, that's probably going to be a bit restrictive, I would say. It's not, most organizations don't have sort of high side networks that might be deployed in areas of government. So, and it's just going to be too restrictive to do business, as it were, for many. So the kind of protective DNS approach is normally we allow everything through except these things, whether that's you blocking whole top-level domains or your millions of indicators of compromise that you've got to block. And that's about letting business do its thing, So yeah, different approach. And I think that's just going into a sort of beta-y type phase at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's right. It's only kind of a preview, but I mean, it does give you an idea of how they will eventually approach zero trust. I imagine that this is the avenue that they're pursuing.
Yeah, and the two things can work together. So in terms of having the Microsoft network and infrastructure work with protective DNS and a sort of authorized source within that architecture, so that you can say yes, it passed. So off you go, and you can communicate.
Yeah. It's interesting that right now, anyway, the Microsoft DNS server doesn't support encrypted DNS. So presumably at some
Yeah,
point, right?
I assume they're going to add it to 2025. I think it's the latest version. So, but I don't think it's there yet.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things that your paper talks about is the variety of attacks that involve DNS in some way or other, and some of them are quite familiar. DDoS attacks, for example, which might target a DNS server or might actually use a DNS server as an amplifier or as a reflector. But others are less familiar, I think. So let's talk about a couple of them that are maybe not as well understood. First of all, dangling CNAME records. Can you talk about what they are and what risks they pose to our listeners?
Yeah, definitely don't leave anything dangling. So a dangling CNAME really is where a domain is referencing another domain, but the risk is typically when that's outside of an organization's namespace, and that domain that's referenced no longer exists. So CNAMEs are simplifying management and administration and allowing organizations to use external services, sort of typically under their own brand. But if the domain that is referred to no longer exists, then a threat actor can take ownership of it. And that's where the dangling part comes in. So a recent example of this would be the US Center for Disease Control. They had a CNAME and alias from their domain pointing to Azure, and the domain name in Azure. So at some point that Azure resource was decommissioned, but the CNAME record in the CDC's own domain name was still in place, pointing to it. The actor then stepped in, put their own content online in Azure using the name that the CDC referred to, and the actor then had their own content under the CDC brand. That content was very questionable. Let's leave it like that. So while actors can, I guess, register new domain names, and that's quite well known, using, registering a domain, using it instantly under one of the top level domains you mentioned earlier that are used because they're very cheap or they're free, in effect, for a year, but you only need to use them for a few hours to do something bad. It's good from an actor's perspective to piggyback off the reputation of something that already exists, in effect, utilizing that brand. And you can use this to bypass security controls as a brand is trusted. Already things like rules around email processing engines will perhaps know that that's a trusted domain. And in effect, the actor can then piggyback off that brand to do things like distribute malicious spam.
Yeah.
Yeah. So really that's about organizations being aware of the risk of all that and managing their public DNS space accordingly.
Right. Which is it's really a hygiene issue, right? I mean, know that, hey, I had this alias and it pointed to this content in Azure or in AWS or what have you, and I'm no longer making that available. Therefore, I should remove the CNAME record. I should remove the alias.
Yeah. And one of the things there is educating the group of people that are using the domain names. You might, as a DNS administrator, get a request to put in place an alias under your own domain name to a resource in Azure. That's great because somebody's putting that up. They're doing a marketing campaign. They're doing whatever they are with that resource. But probably all of us that have been around IT for quite a while are used to people asking for things when they perhaps want them set up. We don't get so many requests when stuff is torn down. So we don't necessarily know it's been torn down. So we have to put in place things like, as you said, DNS hygiene. We have to put in place automation to look for those things, because we're not always going to be told, right?
Yeah. I thought that the way that they exploited that dangling alias, that dangling CNAME record that the CDC had was very interesting because the content that they made available, they were advertising as a free way to stream the Wolverhampton v Chelsea football match, something like that, I think.
I'm from the UK. I'm almost contractually obliged to mention football or soccer, as the Celtics would know it as. But yes, that was one of the clever ways it was exploited. So it didn't make things obvious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it wasn't, there was no obvious relationship between the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control in the US, and instructions on how to stream that for free. But because the CDC is considered an authority, if someone was looking up, say, Wolverhampton streaming, whatever, then that would tend to percolate to the beginning of search results. And I think that was
Mm.
the main reason, right? It was highly credible. It would percolate to the beginning of search results, and people would likely click on it, and then
Yeah.
unfortunately click on some package that they were supposed to install
Mm.
in order to stream the match or what have you. But
Yeah, indeed. That's a piggybacking on a brand. It's also done by malicious actors in relation to email. Because if you've got something like I used to manage Spam Assassin many years ago, you've got those kind of rule-based engines that are scoring things based on reputation, other factors, etc. It's going to bypass your defenses.
Yeah. If anyone is interested, I wrote a blog entry about the CDC breach, and I just pasted it into the chat in case folks are excited about learning more about how not to stream Liverpool versus it's Liverpool actually versus Wolverhampton apparently.
Yeah, I was going to say nobody was probably wanting to stream Wolverhampton, but there we go. Liverpool's more popular.
Yes, that's what I understand. I had a friend in the UK who actually gave me a Liverpool mug that I still have in my office.
Oh, okay.
Never seen them play, but um, what about lame delegations? They're slightly similar in a way, right?
Yeah, so it's all about really the devolved nature of the administration of DNS. So when you register a domain, for instance, example.com, the top level domain.com has a delegation for that to enable the name servers for example.com to be found and queried. This is this inverse tree, as it were, of the DNS hierarchy. You start from the root and you go down. The servers that are responsible for example.com responding to queries for that domain, the authoritative name servers, are often hosted in some infrastructure provider somewhere. And you might, for instance, register a domain for 5 years, but you perhaps got an agreement with the hosting infrastructure provider for a shorter time. Perhaps it's renewed on an annual basis. If the problem comes when there's a disconnect between that. And some of those registrars do not necessarily apply security controls to prevent, say, me going in and just saying I run that domain name. So I go to the same provider as was in use, but I'm not the same actor. I'm a malicious one, and I take over the domain. And once you've taken over the complete namespace there, the complete domain, it can be used for any purposes really. So you could get certificates, you can do whatever you want with it clearly. And we certainly see threat actors that specialize in exploiting that kind of thing. We can call them sitting duck domains or whatever we refer them to. We've even seen actors go in and take over those domains multiple times, but they're different actors because one will use it for a particular campaign that will fall fallow, then another different actor will come in and take that over. So there are certain registrars that allow that. It can be, you can get a lame delegation through other simple things too. There was a relatively recent and fairly well publicized example involving MasterCard. It can happen to the best of us. They had all of their name servers ending in .net, except one of them where the T was omitted. That's actually the country code top level domain, Niger. And so a security researcher noticed this, was able to go in and for $300 registered that name of that name server. So there are those human mistakes as well that can lead to lame delegation. But really the risk there is, however it occurs, it's that an actor can take over your namespace, and then they can do anything. So again, DNS hygiene is really important there.
Yeah, yeah. One of our legion of listeners, Anush, asked a very relevant question about whether Infoblox has any DNS hygiene automation. And I wanted to mention our DNS Advisor tool, which is a very small tool that runs on Windows or Mac OS. And basically, it just does a lot of checking of DNS hygiene configuration. It would identify, for example, dangling CNAME records. It would identify lame delegations. It also checks for things like, do you have a domain name that maps to an IP address? Well, if you do, you should have a pointer record that maps that IP address back to the um, that sort of thing. It does a lot of security tests too. All the tests are configurable. You can determine whether or not they're executed. And it doesn't really require any special access to the network, very much like the tool that Shawn talked about earlier. It just requires the ability to send queries to your DNS server. And it really wants to be able to do its own transfer, because that's the only way to find, for example, dangling CNAME records. But we give it away for free to customers and prospects. So if you're interested, you can contact your Infoblox sales rep or SA, and they can get you a copy of it.
Yeah, I'm sure WEI would do that as part of that sort of assessment process too. If folks are not so familiar with driving that kind of thing, or indeed interpreting the results, that could be useful.
That's right. And I should have also said that WEI as a partner also has access to the tool and can make it available. Yeah. So according to the paper, DNS telemetry is also important for forensic purposes. And I know you talked a little bit about that, and about the fact that you can go in sort of after the fact, after a breach, and find out, for example, how an attacker might have moved laterally within an organization across the network, or at least attempted to. Is that something you can talk a little bit more about, and maybe talk a little bit about some of the mechanisms that are available for actually recording that DNS telemetry?
Yeah, it's a favorite topic of mine, so I can probably talk too much about it. But really, DNS is becoming a data platform as much as it's a service for answering queries. In fact, there can be more overhead involved in collecting the data than there can be answering the queries. And certainly that query and response logging is very valuable. It provides that audit trail for resources that a compromised asset might have attempted to locate, for instance. Helping security operations teams there and incident responders maybe establish the scope of a breach, as you said. What you definitely want to do with protective DNS, though, of course, is actually block the bad stuff and send that to a SIEM and a SOAR. And you want to filter all this data so that you can see the wood for the trees. What you don't want to do is suddenly overwhelm a security operations center with DNS queries. Did a large deployment last year for the NHS, the organisation in the UK. That has 1.5 million users, and there's tens of thousands of queries per second there. Clearly, you can't send all of that to a SIEM, but you may want to log the majority of it for forensic purposes, or perhaps even all of it. So you want to record that data, but it's going to give you insight into threat actor infrastructure if you're in a kind of incident response situation, or even if you're threat hunting, and it's going to help you maybe stitch together discrete security events. So you might see what a threat actor is doing from a command and control perspective. And there's a separate set of domains perhaps used for data exfiltration by DNS. And so you are potentially linking the two activities together with arguably other stuff that you've got on your network, in terms of a data set that you can use and respond to as a threat responder there. Indeed, a sort of Intel team uses that kind of telemetry to really generate the data that gets put into protective DNS. So we've got quite a focus with our threat intelligence team on DNS infrastructure that actors use, such as traffic distribution systems. And that's how we populate protective DNS. But organizations can obviously use that data for their own processes and their own threat hunting. It's just really a goldmine of what your own infrastructure is communicating with. So, if those OT devices are making queries, does that look suspicious, or is that right? Why users are querying everything under the relatively newer .press TLD. I only found out about that yesterday when I thought, what's in the spam house? Top global domains distributing malware potentially, and .press was right up there as a new entry at the top of the charts. So it just shows what's really happening on your network. It's like having a barometer or a temperature control or something like that's instrumenting it all.
Yeah, yeah. Now, if folks are convinced and they think, wow, I need to save that telemetric data somewhere, an archive, SIM, whatever, they should probably know that there are various types of it, right? It's not just, say, query logging that we're talking about, which really just saves information about, what domain name, what class, and what type of data have been looked up and when. It's more than that, right? I mean, we have mechanisms at DNS like query capture, but perhaps the best, sort of the gold standard, is passive DNS, right? So maybe we should talk a little bit about passive DNS and why it was designed and what it gives you.
Yeah, so there's passive DNS above, below, or on the resolver. Um, and really, what you're doing is you're recording DNS data in a structured format. The most common is DNS tab. Um, you can easily translate that into JSON, for instance, and feed that into your security ecosystem if you were blocking that. Um, so you might look at it above the resolver, which is in effect things that have missed your DNS cache. So it's the new queries. You might look at it below the resolver and everything that comes in, even the malformed DNS queries. Um, or you might look at it on the resolver, which is the most common way of recording it now. And the reason for that is encrypted DNS, because you can't record it below the resolver because it's encrypted. So that tends to be the most common thing to do. And using DNS tap is an efficient machine readable format. Definitely more efficient than, say, recording things in syslog.
Yeah, and from a practical standpoint, it's probably worth saying too that syslog query logging, for example, is not only going to give you less data, it's actually going to impose more overhead on your DNS server.
Yeah,
Um, Passive DNS and DNS tap were designed explicitly to place very little load, very little operational load on the DNS server that was doing the logging. So you actually get more data with less overhead. So a better
yeah.
choice.
Yeah, and if you're implementing it on dedicated DNS resolvers that support it, you can sort of manage that overhead as you introduce it. Having done that at quite some scale, it is a consideration you need to be aware of when you turn that on. Um, but you can, if you like, take it further than that, because you may have it as a kind of just in case the worst happens, and you're going to get out all of these logs of what everything on your network has queried and what the responses were. But you might take subsets of that data. For instance, you might remove the top 100 queried domain names, whether it's Facebook or whatever, and you might take out your internal domains in your network, leaving you with a much smaller data set to look at. You might even then process that smaller data set via techniques like a Bloom filter that will tell you which new domains have been queried each day. So you've got a significant subset there, which is something to uh, really use in terms of threat hunting. Infoblox does something in this area called SOC Insights to try and reduce that sort of needle, that volume of data, find that needle in that haystack, as it were.
Mhm. Well, Anush has asked another good question. DNS tap is useful when we don't have a DNS agent on workstations. DNS agents like Infobloxes on workstations should be able to see encrypted queries too, right? And yes, of course. I mean,
Mm,
we are one of the endpoints. We're generating those queries, or at
yeah,
least passing the queries from applications through. So yeah, we definitely have
yeah,
the ability to do that. And that
yeah.
was what you were talking about.
Yeah, the key thing with any deployment really is making sure that you control the DNS traffic as an organization. So, you shouldn't be allowing UDP 453 out of your organization, and it's something that's can often be forgot about. What we talked about earlier with encrypted DNS traffic going to open resolvers, whether it's 8.8.8.8 or whatever, block those well-known resolvers off, because malware will attempt to get around your security infrastructure by doing a query to that kind of thing. So easy steps some people can take to secure stuff and then consolidate traffic on your managed resolvers that are doing this kind of logging, providing that protective DNS service, and really closing that hole, as it were, that we were talking about in terms of zero trust.
Yeah, fantastic. Anush had asked one other question earlier that
Mm.
we didn't get to, which was about the percentage of domains that use DNSSEC that we see. And I thought that you, having a background working for Nominet, would actually have a great perspective on that. You might have the inside angle.
That's a piece of string question.
It,
As Jeff Houston of AP Nick said, it's not only the number of zones that are top level domains that are signed, um, but also the resolvers that might use them, and the take up varies very widely depending on the incentives. There was a conversation that took place at the NIST coordination group where we're talking about a number of things, and one of the policy levers that can be made is reducing the cost of signing zones, for instance, making it the same as registering a zone normally. So the the unfortunate answer is there's a certain proportion signed. I can't remember what the current number is, but if people's infrastructure is not there to get the benefit of that by having a resolver that does DNSSEC validation, then you can sign the zones all you want, but you're effectively not using that. Yeah, so for people unfamiliar on the core DNSSEC, is perhaps most simply described as public key infrastructure along the lines of certificates, where you download something to trust the root in the DNS hierarchy, and you validate a chain of trust down to the endpoint, thus preventing an answer being spoofed. So yeah, people should be deploying resolvers that enable that. And despite perceived historical problems, it's certainly quite widely deployed now. So that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think that the short answer is really that it varies very widely,
Mm.
uh, and very widely, kind of depending on which top level domain you're talking about. So
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
some TLDs where the percentage of subzones that are signed is very, very high. Places that you wouldn't necessarily think of, like BG, which is Bulgaria. It's a solid double-digit percentage that are
okay,
signed. The Czech CZ is widely signed. The Switzerland's CH, Sweden's SE, they're
yeah.
solid
SE
double.
and NL as well. I think NL have driven it through that sort of cost incentive effectively.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. But the
yeah,
percentage under the big generic top level domains like com and net is a small fraction of 1%. It's very, very low,
mm,
unfortunately. Yeah.
mm.
Yeah. Well, I think that we're kind of at the end of our time, but I did want to mention
Yeah,
a couple of things to wrap up. First of all, we talked a lot about the best practices guide that Jim helped to write, and so we should include a link to that at some
yeah,
point. So we'll work with WEI to make sure that that goes out to you, and also please remember to take a look at the new NIST SP
yes.
800-81, which we helped to write. Remember that it's in its comment period until the 26th. And beyond that, thank you so much for tuning in, and I will turn this back over to Shawn and WEI.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cricket and Jim. Really appreciate the conversation today. I was furiously taking notes. Always a great topic. Um, so just a quick wrap up from my side. If you have any questions about the 5-minute DNS security assessment that I mentioned at the top of the call, please reach out to your WEI sales team. If you don't know who they are, reach out to marketing@wei.com, and our marketing team can connect you. And feel free to look us up on LinkedIn, look up Infoblox on LinkedIn, lots of great content. Thank you all for tuning in.